Chapter 3 of The Romance of Modern Engineering. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Modern Engineering by Archibald Williams. Chapter 3, Dams and Aqueducts. Probably few of us whose houses are connected with a public water supply give much thought as we watch the crystal clear liquid issuing from a tap to the journey that it has taken from the point where man first gathered it for his own. Yet, perhaps, it has come many a mile through pipes and tunnels, been flung into reservoirs, strained, filtered, passed again into pipes, first for the town, then for the street, lastly for the house, until fresh from its mountain stream or subterranean cave, it emerges into the unromantic surroundings of the bathroom or back kitchen. Our direct experience of the mechanical side of a water supply is usually confined to the operation so often seen in the minor veins that multiply towards its urban extremity. We know only too well the doings of the plumber and of the laborer who converts the smooth surface of our roads into a dangerous succession of hills and valleys. The consequent bills and rates are apt to blind us to the real romance and magnitude of the work needful to give us our daily water. We must trace the system backwards from our doors, through mains of increasing size, to the very heart and arteries, before we realize how nobly the brain of engineer and muscle of artisan have been employed in the cause of health and sanitation on undertakings about which but a few of those who are directly benefited possess more than a shadowy knowledge or proper appreciation. Those wonderful old builders, the Romans, have shown us, by the stately march of their aqueducts across plain and valley, that the question of a good water supply for large towns pressed even in their days. Since then, the problem has become increasingly difficult in thickly populated countries, on account of the artificial contamination of streams and strata by the processes of manufacture. And while, on the other hand, we see the engineer driven further afield for his source of supply, on the other, we notice that the demand for an even greater consumption per head is pushed vigorously by common sense and scientific consideration. The daily supply of London has reached the enormous total of 200 million gallons, drawn from the New River, the Thames, and subterranean sources. During the last few years, the metropolis has experienced the inconveniences and dangers of a water famine, which have turned men's eyes to schemes discussed in 1866, of tapping the waters of the Welsh valleys, collecting it in huge reservoirs, and bringing it across country by pipelines 180 miles long, at a cost of £12 millions, or of pressing into the service of the Westmoreland lakes with their available storage of some 36,000 million gallons, and connecting them with London by 270 miles of pipes at an outlay of £13.5 million. For their boldness, these schemes may compare with that of the Parisians to fetch supplies from the Swiss lakes across 300 miles of France. At present, none of these projects have come to anything, and the first two have let slip an opportunity, since Manchester now draws from Thirlmere, and Liverpool and Birmingham from the Welsh area earmarked for London. In the following pages, it's proposed to describe at short length the construction of the huge pipelines that help to supply our three largest provincial towns. We will first turn our eyes to Thirlmere in Westmoreland, a picturesque little lake of a natural area of 328¼ acres. Previous to 1894, the great cotton city drew its water from Longondale, a valley situated about 18 miles east, through which flows the River Ethro, one of the principal tributaries of the Mersey. The reservoirs, of a storage capacity of some 6,000 million gallons, collect the water of 19,000 acres and deliver about 25 million gallons a day to the inhabitants of Manchester. The rate of consumption increased so rapidly between 1856 and 1875 that the corporation foresaw a shortage unless a further area were laid under contribution. And after an examination of various sources, it adopted a scheme for impounding the Thirlmere and leading its waters 96 miles to the great reservoirs at Prestwich. An Act of Parliament authorizing the scheme was obtained in May 1879, and 6 years later the glens of Westmoreland began to resound to the snort of engines and clink of hammers. A huge retaining wall gradually arose across the north end of the lake, where it found an outlet into the St. John's Beck. The dam is divided into two portions by a small rocky eminence, through which surplus and compensation water is discharged by means of a tunnel 12 feet wide and 9 feet high. This tunnel is closed by a transverse masonry wall pierced with two 36 and one 18-inch pipes, controlled by valves actuated by hydraulic and hand power. The dam is driven down throughout its length to solid rock, reaching a maximum depth of 50 feet below the riverbed, at which point, as it rises 50 feet above the lake, it has a height of 100 feet. The increase of depth in the lake thus artificially produced gives a total storage capacity of 8,130,686,693 gallons. But for present purposes, only 20 feet of extra depth is necessary for the supply of Manchester. As occasion dictates, the level of the overflow will be raised and a larger body of water impounded. The most interesting part of the scheme is the aqueduct, which brings the limpid stream from under the lofty crest of Helvellyn to a point 4 miles outside Manchester. The Romans, to whom iron piping was unknown, led their aqueducts across valleys on tiers of arches, built at the cost of much labor. The modern engineer is able to adopt the simpler method of gravity flow. By means of siphons, he takes the water down one side of a valley and up the further slope to a point where it finds its own level and continues its onward course in a gentle fall towards its destination. These long pipelines are not hermetically sealed from end to end like the service pipes of a town, for in the case of a large total drop between the source and point of final delivery, there would be an excessive pressure in the siphons at the valley bottoms, the pressure increasing in proportion to the difference in height above sea level between the inflow and the lowest portion of the pipe siphon. The engineer, therefore, after determining the hydraulic gradient or rate of fall in the thermal aqueduct 20 inches per mile, maps out the course of the pipeline in such a manner as to ensure a certain amount of fall between the ends of the siphons, and by placing the upper end of each important siphon on the hydraulic gradient, makes it hydrostatically independent of the rest of the pipeline as regards pressure. The greatest pressure in the thermal aqueduct occurs at the bridge over the River Lune, where the lowest pipes of the siphon have to support a hydrostatic stress of 410 feet, equivalent to 180 pounds to every square inch, and therefore are 1 3/4 inches thick. Another important consideration is the tendency of any fluid or gaseous body enclosed in a pipe under pressure to straighten out that pipe. This effect may be noticed in the flexible tube connecting an air pump with a pneumatic tire. At each stroke, the tube gives a kick, unless it be carefully laid in a straight line. The sharper the curves, the greater is the resistance to the flow of air, and the more pronounced is the resultant kick. It therefore becomes very necessary for the engineer to lead his pipes in as gentle curves as possible, both vertically and horizontally, and at unavoidably sharp bends to anchor them securely to a stable foundation. At the bridge over the Loon, the straightening pull is equivalent to a pressure of 54 tons, which is counteracted by steel straps passed over the pipes and attached to stout anchorages. On the steep descents on the sides of valleys, any slipping of the pipes is prevented by projecting rings which engage with the surrounding bed of concrete. The Thermal Aqueduct is made up of 3 classes of construction: tunnels, 14 miles, cut and cover, 37 miles, pipelines, 45 miles. The tunnels, which were bored out by pneumatic drills, are 7 feet wide and 7 feet 1 inch high, and lined where necessary. The cut and cover lengths have a transverse section of the same dimensions, and a lining of concrete 18 inches thick. Manholes and ventilators are placed every quarter of a mile. Both tunnels and cut and cover lengths will accommodate the ultimate maximum flow of 50 million gallons, but in the metal lengths the channel is divided into 5 parallel pipelines, each 40 inches in diameter, and capable of passing 10 million gallons daily. With the exception of all pipes within 9 miles of Thermal, where the 5-fold line is replaced by a 3-fold of 48-inch pipes. In the first instance, only 1 line was laid, and the others will be added as need arises. The aqueduct, after leaving the lake at the southern end, plunges into Dunmail Tunnel, 5,165 yards long. Then, through a succession of small tunnels, to that of Knapskar, 1,418 yards long. After traversing Skeg Hill, 1,243 yards, in Moor Row, 3,040 yards, tunnels, it is mostly in pipe and cut over, the latter a trench dug to the gradient level, floored and walled and roofed with concrete, and covered in again. Before reaching Manchester, 30 depressions have to be negotiated by siphons of varying depths. As it is at these points that the greatest danger from bursts occurs, we may notice the precautions adopted, which precautions apply in part to Liverpool and Birmingham aqueducts. The most likely point for a burst is naturally at the lowest portion of a siphon, where the pressure is greatest. As a matter of fact, only a very few bursts have ever occurred. But the possible damage resulting from a large body of water let loose suddenly on a countryside is so great that the engineers have taken elaborate measures to reduce such effects to a minimum. At the north and upper end of each of the Thermal line siphons is a well divided into 2 main compartments by a wall. The south compartment is subdivided into 3 or 5 divisions according to the number of pipes supplied, and each of these divisions is connected with the north compartment by a pipe, the open ends of which are flush with the floors. In the north compartment are a number of large bell-shaped vessels, 56 inches in diameter, each of which is suspended, small end downwards, from a lever 18 feet long, having at one end a fulcrum and at the other end a float, supported by the water of one of the southern divisions. In case of a burst in any one of the siphon pipes, the water in its particular southern division at once sinks rapidly, causing the fall of the float, and the motion, transmitted by the lever to the bell barrel, lowers the latter into the mouth of the corresponding pipe, and so cuts off supplies from the burst siphon. The rise in the northern compartment is neutralized by a number of overflow orifices, which conduct the surplus water into a specially prepared channel until such time as the supply is lessened at the thermal end. The water in the siphon has still to be reckoned with, and as two of the siphons are over 9 miles long, the body of included water is very great. In the northern leg of each siphon is therefore stationed a valve, or a succession of valves at intervals, released automatically by an abnormal rate of flow. Briefly described, the valve consists of a metal disc connected in its central line with two trunnions protruding through the walls of the pipe. At the outer ends of the trunnion are pulleys, actuated by chains, to the extremities of which heavy weights are attached. One of the chains, after passing round its pulley, is linked to the end of a piston rod connected with a piston working in a cylinder full of glycerin and water. Above the pipe is an air chamber bolted down to a circular orifice, so that there is an airtight joint between the chamber and the pipe. Athwart the chamber and through its walls runs a shaft, from the center of which depends into the waterway a lever, carrying at its lower end a metal plate 21½ inches in diameter. At one end of the shaft, outside the chamber, is an arm so weighted that the pressure of water on the plate is just counterbalanced, and the latter maintained in a horizontal position. When a burst occurs, the plate is pushed in the direction of the flow, moves over the lever to which it is attached, and communicates the motion to the shaft, which releases a second lever that in turn releases the trunnion chain wheels and permits the weights to rotate the wheels and gradually bring the internal valve disc from a horizontal to a vertical position, completely closing the waterway. The reader has probably noticed the noise of a water hammer resulting from the sudden closing of a tap somewhere on the house supply. The running water, abruptly checked, expends its impetus on the walls of the pipe with a sharp rap that may be heard for a considerable distance. The effect of such a water hammer on the great pipelines would be disastrous, and it is to ensure the very gradual cutting off of the water that the cylinder mentioned above is employed. At the moment when the chain wheels are released, a small cock in the pipe leading from the cylinder is also opened, and the contents slowly escape, permitting the weight attached to the chain to pull round the pulley at a uniform speed. The danger of a water hammer on the southern or lower leg of a siphon is not so great, as the direction of the rush is the opposite of that of the normal flow, so that for an appreciable time after the burst the water is almost in a state of rest, from which it gradually attains a reverse motion. To check its downward flow, check valves are placed, 3 flaps, one above another, opening only in the direction of the normal flow. On a burst occurring, they at once shut against their seats and remain there until the siphon is refilled and the flow resumed. The charging of a siphon is not so easy a matter as might be imagined. The sudden influx of a full column of water might imprison air in the lower parts, compress it, and cause it to burst suddenly up the lower leg, leaving room for a violent rush of water in its track. An ingenious provision for the charging has therefore been made. In each of the large plugs in the siphon wells is a smaller central one, which is opened by means of a lever of U section, supported at a short distance from one end on a fulcrum which rests on the main lever between plug and float. A heavy iron ball, weighing 90 pounds, runs in the channel of the short lever. When the central valve is open, the southern end of the lever is depressed, and the ball remains there until the siphon is full, when the float rises, and by raising the main and small levers, causes the ball to roll along its channel and close the central valve. The large plug is now watertight and ready for the next emergency. The pipes used in such works are manufactured with the greatest care, being cast vertically, socket downwards, so that the densest metal may be at the spot where there is greatest danger of fracture. Each pipe is then tested internally with coal tar oil to an internal pressure of 45 pounds per square inch, in excess of the possible maximum exerted by the water, weighted, and its date, number, diameter, length, and thickness entered in a book, after which it is heated in a stove and dipped in a special anti-corrosive composition. During the laying of the line, the position of every pipe is registered, together with the name of the man who laid it and the date at which it is laid. The joints are made by running in molten lead between the socket of one pipe and the spigot end of its neighbor, a process that is too familiar in most towns to need description. The first contract for the work was let in 1885. In October 13, 1894, the first Delmare water arrived in Manchester, the inhabitants of which town are now assured of a splendid supply for many years to come. From Cumberland, we turn our attention to the equally hilly district of north-central Wales, where are the headwaters of the Vyrnwy, a tributary of the Severn. The valley through which the river flows was once the course of a glacier that scraped deep channels in the rock and piled boulders and stones across the glen so as to create a natural dam, behind which a lake was formed. After many years, this lake was filled in with alluvial deposit, which rose to a height of 40 to 50 feet above the rocky barrier. Who would have thought, 50 years ago, that this natural dam would prove of the greatest utility to far-off Liverpool, situated on the edge of unlimited water, and yet casting anxious eyes towards regions where there was water fit to drink? In an interesting report on the Liverpool water supply, the corporation engineer, Mr. J. Perry, tells us how in 1865 a scarcity of water during the summer and autumn produced disastrous results. Quote, "The consumption was restricted in every way. Trade was impeded, sanitary requirements were neglected, public baths and wash houses were closed, and the death rate from diseases caused and aggravated by a deficiency of water became abnormally high. The medical officer of health for the borough, the late Dr. Trench, in evidence before a committee of the House of Commons, stated that hundreds of lives would have been saved during that season if there had been an increased supply of water." End quote. As a result, great works were commenced in 1868 at Rivington in the Yarrow Valley, where there are now 8 reservoirs of 598 acres surface and a capacity of over 4,000 million gallons, connected with Liverpool by a pipeline 15 3/8 miles long, terminating at the Prescott reservoirs. These works cost the corporation £1.5 million. But they did not suffice, and in 1878, Mr. G. F. Deacon, M.I.C.E., was instructed to survey the Vyrnwy Valley and prepare parliamentary plans in conjunction with Mr. Thomas Hawksley for the creation of a second supply. The necessary act received the royal assent in 1880. As no lake existed from which to draw, the engineers decided to create one by closing the valley with a dam superimposed on the rocky ledge left by glacial action. The dam, which rises 85 feet above the riverbed, is 1,172 feet long, 161 feet high maximum, 127 feet thick at its base maximum, and contains 260,000 cubic yards of masonry, weighing 510,000 tons. Quote, "Below the sill of the dam and above the outlet to the aqueduct. Lake Vyrnwy contains 12,131 million gallons. Its area is 1,121 acres. In a single foot of depth, immediately below the overflow, the lake contains about 304 million gallons. 5 feet lower, a foot of depth contains 292 million gallons. The average cross-section of this remarkable sheet of water does not differ widely from a horizontal base 2,000 feet wide, with a depth of water over it of 70 feet and end slopes of 2¼ to 1. End quote. From Mr. G.F. Deacon, Minutes of Proceedings of the Institution of Civil Engineers. This lake covers the site of the village of Llanwrth, with its 40 cottages, church, school, and 3 chapels. By way of compensation, a new village, church, and churchyard were built below the dam, and thither were removed the living and the dead. The living have gained rather than lost by the move. The new and better houses to live in, a well-regulated river, no longer subject to sudden spates flowing past their doors, a fine carriageway across the valley over the dam, and finally the dam itself, a noble and imposing structure on which the eye may rest with admiration, especially at times when the water passing over the top in an unbroken sheet 700 feet wide thunders down onto the masonry below. Except for the stone and sand, all the materials used in the Llanwrth Dam, such as cement, bricks, timber, iron, machinery, plant, coal, etc., had to be carted over 10 miles of hilly country from the nearest Cambrian railway station of Llanfwrn. The masonry throughout was executed with the most scrupulous care, since the sudden breaking loose of such a body of water at Lake Vyrnwy into the valley of the Severn, with its large towns, would be terrible to contemplate. A great trench was first dug across the valley down to hard, sound rock. Boulders ranging up to hundreds of tons in weight were met with and removed. All long slopes in the sound rock were cut into steps, and the whole surface was scrupulously cleaned with wire brushes and high-pressure water jets, and coated with Portland cement mortar. The interior rubble work of the dam consisted mainly of large stones, 2 to 10 tons in weight, laid by cranes onto carefully leveled beds of cement mortar. As each stone was placed, a number of men beat upon its center with wooden mallets until it had settled down well, and squeezed up some of the mortar between it and the next stones. The interstices were very carefully filled and rammed with different sized tools, blunt-ended swords for the narrowest cracks, and the precaution taken of only half filling the vertical spaces between the last layer of masonry at the end of each day's work. During the nights, Sundays, and holidays, these half-filled cracks were crammed tight with bags to exclude rain, frost, and sunshine. By this means, the perfect junction of the work was assured. The facing stones, cut to rectangular form, were bedded in like manner, but the mortar not brought to the outer edge. Cracks 6 inches deep from the face at the bottom and 3 inches at the top were left and filled in with iron plates until the mortar had set. The cracks were then caulked to within an inch of the face with special cement, very carefully rammed. The result is a face that will suffer a minimum of disturbance from the contractions and expansions of cold and heat. The dam is pierced by 2 culverts carrying pipes for the discharge of the daily 10 million gallons and the monthly 160 million gallons of compensation water. This discharge has entailed an expenditure of £300,000, and except in the Vyrnwy stream itself, where its importance is small, its effect is trifling, and a concession rather to official pressure than to public needs. About 3/4 of a mile from the southeast end of the lake there rises from the water an ornamental tower connected with the public road, constructed by the corporation at considerable expense along the northeast side of the lake by 4 masonry arches. This tower is 170 feet high and stands out 60 feet above top water level. On the outside of the tower are 2 inlet valves, each made up of 6 9-foot tubes superimposed vertically on one another, end to end. By means of internal guides and a system of catches, it's possible to separate any number of these pipes from the pipes below, so as to permit the inflow of water at any one of 6 different levels. The lowest joint is connected by a U-shaped bend with a similar series of tubes working on the same principle in the interior of the tower. This enables the man in charge to draw water from the surface, where it is purest, and introduce it into the tower in a state of approximate quiescence. The floor of the interior is pierced by 3 vertical bell mouths communicating with as many as 46-inch pipes leading to the aqueduct, each of which can be closed by a throttle valve. Over the bell mouths are cylindrical strainers 9 feet in diameter and 25 feet high, of very fine copper gauze. As soon as a strainer shows signs of fouling, it is raised by hydraulic pressure and cleansed by a washing turbine that removes all clogging material from the gauze in a few minutes. A concrete culvert 730 yards long leads the strained water to a tunnel piercing the hill at the southeast side of the lake. This tunnel, 7 feet in diameter and 2¼ miles long, terminates in an open well, in which the inlets of the 3 pipelines are fixed. Each line is, or will be, of such capacity as to pass 14 million gallons daily. The total length of the aqueduct, in which there is very little tunneling, is 67 miles. It falls into 7 main portions, each of which terminates towards Manchester in a balancing reservoir on the hydraulic gradient. At Norton, where the natural level is 110 feet below the gradient line, a fine red sandstone tower of that height was built, carrying in the top an enormous bowl 80 feet in diameter and 31 feet deep at the center. The bowl is supported at the circumference only by steel rollers, which allow for expansive movements. Its capacity of 650,000 gallons renders it the largest bowl in the world. At the River Weaver, the aqueduct sinks into a channel dredged for it in the riverbed, and is held down by flanges engaging with stout piles. Between Norton and the Prescott reservoirs, the engineers had their hardest work to do, for in addition to crossing 4 railways, the aqueduct encounters 4 canals and the River Mersey. The Manchester Ship Canal length was carried out during the construction of the canal by cut-and-cover work, a culvert 305 feet long being built with terminal shafts at each end of ample section for 3 lines of 36-inch steel pipes. Scarcely had the aqueduct risen on the north side of the canal when it descends again for a long plunge under the Mersey. Quote, "In point of difficulty, this work proved to be the most important upon the whole aqueduct. It was the first tunnel ever constructed by means of a shield under a tidal or other river through entirely loose materials. A romantic and instructive account might well be written of the battles with the elements, of the repeated failures and successes, and of the hairbreadth escapes with ultimate pronounced success which attended this subterranean and subaqueous work." End quote. From Mr. G. F. Deacon, Proceedings of the Institute, CE. The tunnel was only 900 feet long and but 9 feet in internal diameter, yet its construction occupied 47 months, baffled 2 contractors, and had to be completed by the corporation engineer, Mr. G.F. Deacon. The company had contemplated laying the pipes in the Mersey bed in the same way as had been done at the Weaver, but the parliamentary committee ordered a tunnel under the river. Owing to the loose and porous nature of the Mersey bed, the engineers at first proposed a tunnel that should be 104 feet below the surface of the Cheshire and 174 feet below the Lancashire side. But the estimate cost was so heavy that they decided to drive a horizontal tunnel 50 feet below high water mark. The first contractors in 20 months had sunk the shafts and driven the tunnel for 57 feet. They then ceased work. The second contractors drove and lined 182 feet from the Lancashire shaft and then also relinquished the task. The great obstacle was the difficulty in keeping water off the working face. In sinking a vertical shaft under air pressure, it is easy to prevent the water from passing under the edge of the shield, which is horizontal and therefore acted upon by an external head of water at all points equally. But in the case of a tunnel, the shield is vertical, and the head increases towards the bottom of the face, so that, where a porous waterlogged stratum is encountered, if the pressure inside the shield suffices to keep out the water from the lower portion of the face, it may overcome the water pressure of the upper portion and force the air out and upwards. If, on the other hand, the upper portion only is considered, the pressure may not be great enough to exclude leakage into the lower part of the face. Matters were further complicated in the Mersey Aqueduct tunnel by the head of water in the stratum varying with the tides. The shield employed by the second contractors was too light for the work, and the cutting edge collapsed for 1/4 of its circumference. When Mr. Deacon took over the responsibility, he had first to repair the shield, a matter of great difficulty, but when the process was completed, operations progressed at a satisfactory rate, except during 12 days consumed in further repair. At the end of 4.5 months, the tunnel was completed, the lining of cast iron segments being placed in position behind the shield as the latter advanced. The aqueduct is furnished with stop valves every 2.5 miles, and with 11 automatic valves similar to those in the thermal aqueduct to shut in case of a burst. In 1893, a telephone system was installed between Prescott and Vernry, a double line for speaking, and a number of short lines from the automatic valves to the nearest signal station, so that an alarm will be given immediately after the occurrence of an accident. On November 28, 1898, the outlet valves of the Vernry Dam were closed, except those for compensation water, and by November 25 of the following year, a new lake had been formed to the overflow level. The quantity of water now delivered through the pipes, single line, from a Westry to Prescott Reservoir is 15.5 million gallons a day. The Birmingham Scheme. The third aqueduct that we shall consider in some detail is one which in a few years will connect Birmingham with the headwaters of the Wye in 2 valleys of the Radnorshire. As at Manchester and Liverpool, the rapid increase of population has compelled the authorities to derive an adequate water supply from a district favored with a heavy and uncontaminated rainfall. Mr. James Mansurg, called into consultation by the corporation, laid his hand upon the little rivers Elan and Clytun in distant Wales as the source from which the great hardware town should draw a copious supply. The scheme for impounding these rivers in the same manner as the Vernry was of course a very expensive one, but the common sense of the Birmingham ratepayers determined that the outlay must be faced, with the result that a bill introduced by Mr. Chamberlain in 1892 received the prompt sanction of Parliament, granting the corporation borrowing powers to the extent of £6,600,000. At a spot half a mile below the junction of the valleys of the Elan and Clytune is reared a masonry dam 120 feet high and 600 feet long, which will pen in a serpentine reservoir extending a mile up the Clytune and about 2 miles up the Elan Valley. This reservoir is but one of 6 that will be eventually formed by as many dams, rising like a gigantic water ladder up the valleys. The total storage will be 18,000 million gallons, ensuring a maximum daily supply to Birmingham of 77 millions, in addition to 27 millions of compensation water to the Wye. At present, 4 dams are in progress. The lowest, the Cabincook, referred to above. The next, the Carrigdhu, a submerged dam only a few feet high. And the third, Pennegarrig, 128 feet high and 525 feet long. The fourth, Craiglocch, 120 feet high and 625 feet long. The first will impound 8,000 million gallons, Pennegarrig 1320 millions, and Craiglocch 2,000 millions. The surface of each reservoir at highest level reaching to the foot of the dam further up the Elan Valley. When a still larger quantity is needed, 2 other dams will be built across the Clybourne and their reservoirs connected with the main at Cabincook by a tunnel cut through the intervening hill. When the dams are completed, there will be seen a succession of beautiful lakes nestling between slopes well clad with woodland down to the water's edge. The masonry is of the usual solid description prevailing in such works, the greatest breadth of the foundation being about equal to that of the maximum height. For the accommodation of the workmen, a regular village has been laid out on one side of the Elan, with streets of houses, a school, recreation rooms, a corporation public house, where limited quantities of liquor are sold at certain hours, and well-ordered hospitals. A bridge over the river is the only approach, and every one who would enter the village to seek employment is examined as to his physical condition, health, and capacities before he is allowed to cross. A sort of octroi is established at the bridge end to keep out contraband articles, among which liquor is chief. Thanks to these arrangements, the health and well-being of the community has been maintained at a high level, and the precedent is one which may with great advantage be followed. End of Chapter 3.